for SECA's Annual Sustainability Lecture and the launch of our new Socio-Ecological Justice Series. My name is Amanda Slevin. I'm the Director of the Centre for Sustainability, Equality and Climate Action, or SECA, which I co-direct with my dear colleague, Professor John Barry. It's a special night for us here to have someone as wonderful as Professor Molly Scott Cato come and launch our series and contribute to the work of SECA. I might want to say a few words about SECA, where our lecture series has come from, and then I'll hand over to John to welcome and introduce Molly properly. In 2019, John and I co-founded SECA as the university's Centre for Sustainability, Equality and Climate Action, part of the School of History, Anthropology, Philosophy and Politics. From the outset, we wanted SECA to be an inclusive, critical space for interdisciplinary collaboration, learning and research. And over the past 4 years, throughout COVID, resource constraints, and the not insignificant matter of our involvement in Northern Ireland's first Climate Change Act, SECA has evolved and grown to encompass over 90 members from across all faculties in the university, from colleagues in other institutions and civil society. Over the last 4 years, we have hosted a wide range of activities and events, such as these. This is the first of our Socio-Ecological Justice Series, and the first annual Sustainability Lecture we've had in several years here in SECA. And through SECA, we're striving to develop a thriving interdisciplinary community of researchers, to educators and involvement colleagues from the public and private sectors as well. So tonight, speaking as an environmental sociologist, I'm particularly excited to be here for our launch of the Socio-Ecological Justice Series, which seeks to offer multi-level solutions and insights and analysis from across diverse disciplines on the most pressing socio-economic, ecological and political challenges humanity has ever faced. A consistent thread across all our events, which commence this evening as part of this Socio-Ecological Justice Series, is attention to SECA's core pillars of equality, sustainability and climate action, which are both principles and underpinning threads in our work. And making the global local, as this lecture will do tonight, our series is concerned with deep reflection and action, in line with Paulo Freire's articulation of praxis as a way of how we change the world through reflection and action for change. So I'm a bit excited about this, and I'm not going to hold you, because you're not here to listen to me, but I just want to let you know that this is the first of a series of events, and keep an eye on SECA's mailing list. Instead of SECA's mailing list, keep an eye on our website. We will have another event in December where we have Dr. Claire Kelly coming up from Trinity College Dublin. We will resume in January with Professor Bologna Gokay from Keele University, and we have other speakers lined up for February, March and into April as well. So we have a really exciting series of events lined up, but I will now hand you over to Professor John Barry to properly introduce Molly.
That's great, thanks Amanda, and lovely to see so many people here today. Thanks for coming along. Dia Div Galer. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Molly Scott Cato, who's Professor Emerita, who I've known for quite some time. Molly and I share many things, clearly not dress sense, obviously, but like me, Molly is a former elected politician for the Green Party in the European Parliament, and she served in the European Parliament as MEP for the southwest of England from 2014 to 2020. And she's also Green Party spokesperson on finance and the EU. But like me, she's also an academic and has published widely on green politics and indeed my own area of green economics and political economy, with a particular interest in localism, anti-capitalism, and indeed nuclear power, and why she is so adamantly against it, which we may get into in the discussion. Which is also an internationally recognised expert and scholar on cooperative studies. She's also the author of numerous books: Can't Pay, Won't Pay, Debt, the Myth of Austerity and the Failure of Green Investment, that's one of our latest ones, The Bioregional Economy, The Paradox of Green Keynesianism, Environment and Economy, Green Economics and Introduction. I think I'm prolific, but actually I'm in the halfpenny place when it comes to you, Molly. But my favourite two, in terms of the titles of our books, are Market Schmarket, Building the Post-Capitalist Economy, and my all-time favourite, Albert McFray and Other Lies About Work. So I definitely encourage you to check out Molly's back catalogue. She has no difficulty with the second difficult album, clearly. And also, given the day that's in it, this is the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. And while I'm here, I want to congratulate all the students and those members of staff who stood outside today at 12:30 to 1:30 to show solidarity with the Palestinian people and to stop genocide in Gaza. And I would say, particularly if the Vice Chancellor is listening, I find it really uncomfortable and shameful as a member of this institution that our Chancellor Hillary Clinton has publicly stopped any discussion around a ceasefire, as if calling a ceasefire is to make some pro-Hamas statement. And I think that is, in my view, shameful. But actually, Molly has long supported what we now call BDS, boycott, divestment and sanctions. You weren't expecting to go off on this tangent, were you? And has long, both as a Green Party activist and indeed as an MEP, called for the non-importation and boycotting of Israeli goods from the occupied territories, particularly settlements, illegal settlements beyond the Green Line. And indeed her sympathy, which is something I didn't know, her sympathy with the Palestinian people goes back to her time teaching there when she was a student in the West Bank. So, can I invite you all to put your hands together and give Molly a warm Belfast welcome as she addresses us on the topic of who owns the future. Molly.
Thank you very much. That's a very kind introduction, and I'm very, very pleased to be here, very pleased to be in Ireland. And really, I've had a few days in the south, and it's a delight to come back to Belfast and your beautiful university. So, when you're invited to give a sustainability lecture, it's a challenge to avoid indulging in some pretty outrageous cliches. We are in an existential struggle for the future of humanity. We stand on the brink of an unprecedented transformation of our society and our economy. We are at a turning point in history. While these may all sound like hyperbole, and there's always a risk of a solipsistic fallacy when you're dealing with these kind of statements, I actually do believe all three of these statements are true. This gives us an enormous responsibility as human beings alive at this point in history. I've got a lot of slides here, I've got a lot to get through, but I've got a colleague over here who's going to wave if I go on for too long, so hopefully we'll cover quite a lot of turf. So, where are we going in this lecture? I would start by saying that the word daunting does not begin to cover the challenges facing us. We need to be the people who can grasp the enormity of the situation we're facing and still act. I'm going to start by briefly addressing some of those psychological challenges of living at this time and being able to act at this time. What I take from the literature on climate anxiety is that psychological health is best maintained through having a clear sense of action and implementing that action in a strong and hopeful community. I hope I'm going to be able to share some pointers about how we might do that. And just to say, because of the reference to Gaza and because of this situation with the climate emergency that I'm going to be talking about, I think it's really important to be clear about the emotions this brings up for us. I've shared already the fact that my granddaughter was born a week ago, and I don't know if that makes you particularly emotional, but I can't deal with these topics without getting emotional. So I don't feel any need to apologise for that, but I'm just saying that clearly up front. If I start weeping here, you can imagine me thinking of her. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the psychology of where we're at. It's not my specialist topic, but I feel we need to address that at the start because it's important, because these are difficult times for us as human beings, as psychological beings. But I'm also going to cover the territory of political economy, where I feel more at home. And this is why I've made the concept of ownership central to my theme. I'm going to bring to bear my experience as the European Parliament's rapporteur on sustainable finance to discuss the role of finance in achieving sustainability. And I hope you will excuse me if I spend a little bit of time indulging my shamanic side as well, considering how ownership and vested rights might play a part in protecting our beautiful planet. And now I've said that, it sounds like quite a wide turf, but I'll try and get through it with you. So this is my first question. How much do you care? I think a lot of us saw Alok Sharma's response to what was happening at the COP26 conference. Obviously, we've got COP28 beginning tomorrow, 2 conferences on from this one. He was unable to continue speaking because he was overwhelmed by the emotion that he experienced when thinking about the enormity of the responsibility he carried for the whole world and the consequences as the agreement that had been reached slipped out of his fingers. Now, we know that India and China blocked the text on a phase out of fossil fuels. How anybody can argue about the need to phase out fossil fuels at this stage we're at is quite extraordinary. And I think what's important in dealing with the psychology of climate anxiety is to acknowledge that there are important progresses being made as well. So I'm going to talk a bit about renewable energy and the important progress being made there, but actually China in particular is leading the world in the installation of renewable energy. And I heard today that they are likely to maximise their CO2 emissions long before the 2030 date that they've agreed. And so it's important that we do acknowledge the rapid changes that are being made while also being clear about the big changes we need to, the additional changes that we need to make. So we should understand that most of the world's economies are now accepting the need for net zero. I'm not going to go into the technicalities of what net zero means, but feel free to come back to that in the questions. But that has been a major change in the past decade and an important change. But in terms of climate justice, we're still seeing that failure on the loss and damage agenda, which means that although the countries that are responsible for the damage that's being done by the climate crisis are not agreeing to recompense financially the countries that are bearing the brunt of it. So there are good aspects to this story, but I would say that my overall conclusion is that we are failing current and future generations. We often hear that, don't we? We are not taking sufficient action on the climate crisis. But it's very important to ask, who are this we? Is it the people in this room? Is it the people in this country? Is it the people in Somalia? I think I'm going to talk a little bit more later about exactly who those people are. Can we shift that mutual blame game towards a clear sense of communities working against the faceless corporations and fossil fuel companies and energy-hungry oligarchs who are actually the we when we talk about the people who are failing current and future generations? It's when we identify that, we recognise that what we've got on our hands here is a political struggle. And actually, I think it's important for our emotional well-being that we recognise that as well. It's not about how much can we do. That matters, but actually it needs to be political change. It's not something that we can achieve on an individual level. Oh, John kindly gave me a thing which I'm not using, but I am going to use it. Excellent. So I think as we go through this struggle together, as we do what we need to do to address this crisis, we need to have this sense of resilience, build this resilience, share it in a community and understand how we can be resilient so that we can take action together. So what sort of things help us act in a resilient way, even though we're facing this critical situation? I think it's really important to have that sense of how you interact with the world and engage with the world as an individual. I think you need to take on board that action. I certainly have read in the literature that climate anxiety is best assuaged by people working together and taking action as a community. And I'm certainly going to share some ideas about what sort of action might be appropriate. It's also very important that we have available good social resources. It's quite surprising, maybe I'll even say shocking to me, that a lot of educational institutions that are dealing with young people who are confronting this crisis, and actually we're probably teaching them about this crisis, but do we have the support to go along with that, the emotional and social support? And lastly, we need to find specific coping strategies. I've already confessed that my main one is, period dramas on TV, but you can, find anything that works for you, as long as it doesn't use much energy. That's all I ask. But aside from the communities of action, we also need the good news stories to keep us sane and to keep us energized. And in the area of energy, there's actually a great deal of good news to be shared. I particularly like this graphic that came from the European Greens. That slogan obviously worked better in French, where isolé is the same for both parts of it. But anyway, it worked pretty well in English as well. Last winter, I think, really brought a step change in people's understanding of the reality of the energy transition in their lives. I certainly felt when I wasn't turning my heating on that I was doing something in solidarity with the people of Ukraine. Most years I just think I'm being extremely stingy. Now that I live on my own, I don't have my kids complaining about that, fortunately. But yeah, we did learn a lot through that crisis. We learned that our energy dependence actually undermined our resilience in ways that we'd never thought about before. And again, we need to be questioning that we. And when we do that, it's important that we note what a powerful impetus this question gave, especially in Germany, how that really impelled them to move through the energy transition with a great deal more speed than previously. I think everybody in this room is aware that the first thing we need to do in terms of energy is demand reduction. It's obvious that needs to come before other proposals, and that relies on a big home retrofit programme, but publicly funded home retrofit. I paid £40,000 to retrofit my home. I was an MEP. We all know MEPs have paid too much money. I stashed that money, and when I came back, I paid to have my home retrofitted. But how many people can afford that? It's not acceptable that somebody like me now lives in a well-insulated home that's cheap to heat, when the people on the lowest income are living in the coldest homes. I was very pleased to see that today the Scottish Government launched a really ambitious programme for home insulation, and actually I know because I've seen the press release that Labour's going to announce something similar tomorrow. These are not sort of glamorous things that people get excited about, but they're absolutely fundamental to tackling the climate crisis, and to tackling the climate crisis in a socially just way. Investment in renewables is clear, and I'm going to talk about that in a bit. And then we also need to really make progress with storage and smart use, so that we're using, so that we're doing our washing in the middle of the night when there's excess energy. So there we are. So we have amazing renewable energy resources here. I live on the southwest of England, so I'm quite well aware of what a windy country we are. And we actually have some of the best renewable resources in the world. The only reason we aren't already at 100% renewables ourselves is because of the lack of political will, because we have a government that decides it's more important to have a preserved view, and that 3 people in the community can say stop a wind farm, than to actually install the cheapest form of renewable energy in a windy country like ours. Other countries have done considerably better. Iceland and Costa Rica are already both 100% renewable. Costa Rica is a very impressive country, also where Cristina Figueres came from, who's the reason we have the Paris Agreement. So I think that really demonstrates the importance of local political leadership as well, because she's managed to lead the world, but she's also managed to lead her country, which is not one of the world's wealthiest countries, to 100% renewable energy. Uruguay, Tajikistan and Norway are not far behind reaching 100% renewables, and actually we'll soon be able to add Scotland to that list as well. So, this is, I think, a very exciting part of a good news story, and something that's actually happened tremendously quickly. People say that you can't, that the global economy is a super tanker and it's going to take a long time to turn it around. Well, you already know that I'm some kind of green nut, because well, I don't know if you were told that I came here on a boat, but I don't fly, and I haven't flown for quite a long time. So I wanted to go to Brazil. I did actually have to fly in one direction because I could only get 6 weeks off from work. But I said, well, I'll come back by cargo ship. That taught me many things. But one thing it taught me is a cargo ship can turn around in its own length. So for some reason, I felt really absurdly happy about that. It actually made no difference to anything, but symbolically, it mattered a lot to me. And I do see the global economy, turning around with enormous speed. Try and think back in your own life when you reach that point of thinking we're going to live in a world without fossil fuels. I know for me that came after I was elected as an MEP, so it's less than 10 years. And yet everybody knows that now, apart from obviously people who have money invested in fossil fuel companies. Everybody else is completely clear about that. So that is a huge change and a rapid transformation in the way we think about our economy. So here's another really encouraging graphic. This is just focusing on coal now, and it's focusing on how long really the demand for coal in our economy. And you can see that in 2022 it fell to its lowest level since 1757, when George II was king and Mozart was still a baby. So, I mean, this is, and look how quickly that's happened as well. Rapid decline in our use of coal. But I think what we need to recognise with our use of coal is that what we did in the UK is we substituted gas. We had a dash for gas instead of moving straight to renewables. I like to show this picture of the interconnectors. I've been in Dublin having meetings with various ministers about what the path back to EU membership might look like. And I love to think of us still being connected to Europe. We are still connected to Europe, guys. It's just that it's through these energy connectors, but lots of other connections as well and opportunities to build on them. So we've thought a bit where our energy comes from, and lots of us have reflected on the fact that dependence on fossil fuels is not just destroying our climate, but has also placed us in the hands of authoritarians. And by contrast, homegrown renewables offer the prospect of a future of security and peace. This isn't, sorry, I'm still on this one. This isn't a picture of splendid isolation. Energy, when you're talking about renewable energy, self-reliance is not the answer. The answer is to have these interconnections. The way I visualize this is imagine a sort of front coming off the Atlantic. It's going to reach the west coast of Ireland and all those windmills will be whizzing around like mad there. And that'll be passed right through the island of Ireland, and then eventually that'll be passed through interconnectors to the UK mainland, and then we'll be passing electricity back to Ireland, and as that front goes across, we'll then be passing it on to mainland Europe. And that's how renewable energy works, and that's the answer to the question: what will you be doing when the wind isn't blowing? You know, because the wind will probably be blowing somewhere else. I've got more answers to that question if somebody else asks that question, because yeah, probably not in this audience, but in many audiences, it's the first question to come. So yeah, it's not a picture of splendid isolation, but a direct form of collaboration and cooperation. And these interconnectors are a practical demonstration of that. But we should always begin with local supply and community security. And what we need most is a different kind of thinking and the sort of community entrepreneurship that community energy companies offer. And that takes me on to my discussion of why ownership matters in this time of crisis and in the energy transition and the sustainability transition more widely. So in spite of the best efforts of the fossil fuel lobby to make the climate crisis into a culture war, there is no question that the energy transition is underway and is now irreversible. But will the sustainable world also be a fairer world? The transition to fossil fuels created many built-in injustices compared to a world where, for many, energy meant gathering firewood. Now, I do have an abiding interest in the 14th century, but I'm not going to go into the detail of pannage rights and what exactly you were allowed to gather and what you weren't allowed to gather. But it is important to say that the exploitation of first coal and then oil turned landowners who'd been previously had previously unrecognized energy resources, and that handed them a card in the game of life that they were able to play to make enormous fortunes. And the rest of us have paid for those fortunes ever since fossil fuels were discovered and exploited. This slide shows you just one of those who became the oligarchs of their day, thanks to their exploitation of mineral resources on their land. This is the second Marquis of Bute, shown with Cardiff Castle, just one of his 4 rather impressive homes. He actually wasn't entirely made through fossil fuels because he came from an aristocratic family to start with. I use him as my example, and that's for entirely personal reasons, because my Welsh family worked in his Dowlas ironworks, and my grandfather took me on a very politically charged fact-finding mission when I was in my teens to make sure I understood some of these fundamental issues of social justice. I'm sure we've all got people like that in our family. Those of us that ended up on the left, anyway. So, it's obvious who owns these resources, the people who own the land that they're underneath. But renewable energy really is different from that. Who really owns the wind or the sun? It's clear that communities are impacted when those resources are exploited. And if they don't see any benefits, then they might oppose those developments. In England, as I've already said, we've seen a ban on onshore wind, which is the cheapest form of renewable energy. That's introduced effectively in 2015, when it needed almost consensus from the community for planning permissions to succeed. But the countries where renewables have really taken off, it's often about community ownership. So here's an illustration of what happened with electricity production in Denmark. And you can see a dramatic decline in the use of coal to generate electricity, as I showed you in the case of the UK. But in the case of Denmark, rather than shifting to gas, they moved directly to wind power. And wind power has been hugely popular in Denmark, and that's because a lot of it is owned by citizens, and they themselves see the returns. They own their own energy supply. In an era of renewables, there's no reason why we shouldn't own our own energy supply. It wouldn't be about paying bills, it would be about investing in your community when you buy your energy. So by buying shares in the Middelgrunden Energy Cooperative, 8,500 Danish citizens raised some 23 million euros, half the total project cost, and they became equal partners in a new wind farm. Today, most of that money is repaid, and the investors are getting 7% a year. This is a national change that's happened in the ownership of energy in this country. By 2016, 67% of onshore wind energy in Denmark was generated by citizen-owned parks. 67%, so 2/3 of their energy. You could have had that here, folks. Anyway, no tears, shedding no tears. This production, together with bioenergy and offshore wind generation, grew the country's share of clean electricity to more than 50% by 2019. Imagine if we had had a supportive political framework for community renewables in the UK. Not only would we be 100% renewable for electricity by now, but local communities could have benefited from tens of millions of pounds that in reality have gone to a range of private sector shareholders and authoritarian regimes that control fossil fuels. This is also the answer to the attempt by the fossil fuel lobby to turn us against each other as we go through this vital transition. They've moved on from denying that it's man-made activity that's causing the climate crisis, and they've now moved into this space telling people on low incomes that they're going to be cold unless they have fossil fuels. That is their next big lie that is threatening our future. It's vital that we share the fruits of the new energies fairly and that we do not allow the opportunities of the sustainable future to be captured by some, by a small few, in fact. Unless we undertake the transition in an equitable way, it will fail. And looking at this from the other perspective, those who currently control the vast majority of the world's resources are the ones holding us back from achieving sustainability. So there's a vital link there between the ownership of energy and the speed at which we can make this transition. So sustainability is an existential issue, but it's also an equity issue. We've known for some time that the emissions of CO2 are very unequally distributed according to your income, but there's some really useful research coming through now that's demonstrating this. I've got all the references in the notes, so if you want to have the slides, I'm sure John can make them available and you can see where these reports are published. So this report was published a couple of weeks ago, and it was published by Oxfam, and it shows that 10% of the world's population are responsible for half of all global emissions. And they are key to ending the climate crisis. The world's richest 10% actually encompasses most of the middle classes in developed countries. So most people, well, probably everybody in this room will be in that group. Anyone paid more than $40,000 a year or £32,000 a year is in that top 10% in terms of global income. And we are the high energy consumers. But the most important thing to note is that as you get to the super rich, as you get to the oligarchs, they have absolutely extraordinary levels of energy use. So the richest 1% of people in the world account for more carbon emissions than the poorest 66%. It's really mind-blowing. And when we talk about climate justice, this is what we mean, because the people on the lowest incomes are the people that are bearing the brunt of the crisis. So I think whatever we say about climate justice, this is the sort of statistic, this is the sort of understanding that we have to start from. But there's also hope here, because it's only by reversing that gross and accelerating inequality that mars our global community can we hope to save ourselves. We need to do these two things at the same time. That's why the call for climate justice is so important, because it's also a call for the ending of global inequality. We literally are all in this together, and we need to acknowledge our moral equality and the need for social justice if we are to survive as a human species in anything like what we currently recognise as civilization. This is why people on low incomes fear the transition, because they already are living low carbon lifestyles as well as low income lifestyles. Sorry, I've distracted you with the bonobo. I'm still on the slide. Apologies. It was a bonobo. You'll see it when we get there. So this is why people on low incomes fear the transition, because they're already living low carbon lifestyles as well as low income lifestyles, and they fear any reduction in their income. And that's how they're being appealed to by people that are selling this false narrative that what we want is to make poor people poorer. They don't need to change because they're already there. They're already living those low carbon lifestyles. It's people like us that need to change. But there's another often unaddressed source of global inequity attached to the energy transition, and especially when we think about the net part of net zero. And this runs the risk of creating a new era of global injustice that I have referred to as climate colonialism, or Empire 2.0. Now we get to see the bonobo. There he is. So this is a little word about offsetting and what's really going on when you think you're using some part of the planet to absorb your CO2 emissions. I've always been sceptical about offsetting because it always felt too good to be true. And detailed research demonstrates that this suspicion is confirmed. The official offsets happen through a UN framework known as REDD, which stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Degradation. And that was established as a framework in the Paris Agreement in 2015. So REDD projects aim to slow deforestation, for example, by supporting farmers to change their practices. And they quantify the carbon saved through reducing deforestation relative to what would have happened without the project. And then they sell these emissions reductions as credits. So you can then use these credits to offset the emissions associated with your flights if you're still flying. Just as an example, to offset your emissions on a flight from London to New York would cost you £16.44 of REDD credits. And that money apparently would be used to conserve rainforest in the Congo Basin, that is the habitat for bonobos and forest elephants. Now, £16.44 doesn't sound like very much money, does it? And in fact, the analysis that was carried out on these offsets shows that the slowing of forest degradation and hence the CO2 emissions absorbed were far lower than what was claimed. But there's additional problems as well, because offsetting could actually increase emissions if people or companies feel more comfortable emitting carbon if they believe they can undo that damage simply by buying some carbon credits. And of course, keeping warming well within 2 degrees C, which we agreed to do in Paris in 2015, will require that most deforestation is stopped and in parallel reduction in fossil fuel use. So it's not like I'll use fossil fuels and then somehow the forest can offset those. We need to be doing both those things at the same time. There is a stringent limit to the extent to which one can be used to balance out the other. And lastly, but probably most seriously, is the fact that often these forests are conserved by stopping farmers in low-income countries from clearing land for agriculture, essential subsistence agriculture that they need to feed their families. So your long-haul flight, when you buy the offset, might come at the expense of others actually being able to feed their children. I think, this is why I wanted to address this in terms of the question, who owns the future? Because at present, what we're seeing is global oligarchs using their private jets, and in the case of Bill Gates, then somehow saying he can offset that by buying up a large part of Gabon or some other African country and planting trees there. To me, that encapsulates climate injustice, and we cannot allow some people to continue with those massive emissions, which come at the expense of some of the world's most vulnerable people. Right, I'm going to take a little chassis to the side now and talk a little bit about sustainable finance, partly because this is an agenda I know quite a lot about, having worked on it as a legislator, but also because it's not going to please John very much. It's not very revolutionary, but it is quite interesting in terms of the way finance, which you think of as being pretty immovable and pretty immoral, and actually how that is being shifted in a positive direction. And I think there are some achievements here which I'd like to share with you, because again, well, partly because I put some effort into making them work, so it'd be nice to spend some time talking about them, but also because I think there is something positive to say here. So where did it all start with the sustainable finance agenda? Well, you can see quite an interesting bunch of politicians there. That's Copenhagen in 2009, and anybody who was involved in climate action at that time knows that that conference was generally considered to be a failure. There wasn't agreement. This is a great shame, because if we'd agreed in 2009, we wouldn't be in the mess we're in now. But when the Copenhagen climate talks fell apart, there was a bunch of well-meaning experts on climate and finance, and they were apparently sitting together in a pub somewhere in Copenhagen drowning their sorrows. And they realised that if we were going to make this work, then they had to connect the climate crisis with finance. There was already the Stern Review on the economics of climate change, which was commissioned by Gordon Brown, and that has really shifted the discussion on a global basis and reached this idea of putting a price on carbon. But what happened following the Copenhagen talks was introducing these concepts that link the changes we need to make around our use of fossil fuels directly with the financial value of assets. And so the first concept they came up with was this concept of a carbon bubble. And essentially what that means is it compares the value of the fossil fuel assets that's out there and booked on people's balance sheets with the amount of that fossil fuel that we can use if we're going to stay within a livable climate. And what you discover is that actually most of the fossil fuel assets out there are stranded assets, meaning they can never be realised, so they don't have the value that they're currently shown as having. Now, this has definitely led to a removal of people's investments from fossil fuels, and that's what we refer to as divestment. So often you hear divestment in terms of people making a moral decision not to have their pension in tobacco or fossil fuels or whatever. But actually now divestment is a financially sensible strategy because fossil fuels simply will not have that value in the future. And there's a sort of bit of a nasty chicken game going on between the fossil fuel industry, who say we don't think politicians are serious about removing fossil fuels, and the people who are ethical investors and are saying no, we do need to shift our investment away from fossil fuels. The scale of asset stranding is really immense. So back in 2022, it was estimated that 60% of oil and gas reserves and 90% of coal reserves had to remain unused if we were going to keep the global climate within 1.5 degrees of warming. There was a more detailed study back in 2013, and that showed that between 20 and 40% of assets booked as reserves could not be realised if climate targets were to be met. So you can see that we're talking about, this is the scale of losses we're looking at if we take that action on the climate crisis, and it does help to indicate the vested interests that are resisting the kind of moves that we're trying to make. It's not just fossil fuel industry themselves, it's all the people who have investments tied up in fossil fuels. Incidentally, I'm talking a lot about climate and fossil fuels, but there's a lot of other asset stranding going on. So just to take a few of these examples, as technology costs fall, as it becomes cheaper to produce electricity using solar or wind power, again, fossil fuel assets will lose a lot of their value. Similarly, just changes in the law or changes in people's preferences, again, these remove the value of assets. And this is very serious if you're an asset manager. So one of the things that I tried to do as a legislator was to say, well, if we change the laws so that we tighten up regulations, for example, on organic farms, then we will be stranding all the organic farms in Europe. That's effectively happening already, because you can only run an intensive organic farm if you use an awful lot of antibiotics on the animals, routine use of antibiotics. Now, one of the pieces of law I worked on was to end the use of routine antibiotics on farms. So over 5 years or so, all Europe's organic farms are going to become stranded assets, which I find a really exciting prospect. But it's an indication of the way you can use law combined with these financial values to really shift the way people are investing and the way the economy is working. But of course, the most important thing that came out of the Copenhagen process and the understanding of sustainable finance was this idea of putting a price on carbon. And that's obvious, isn't it? Because we're talking about a market system. Markets respond to incentives, and the main market signal is price. So if you make it expensive to produce carbon dioxide, then everybody in the company has an incentive to give up the use of fossil fuels. And your main friend in the company now is the accountant, and that's a good place to be. So I am a big fan of a carbon tax, and we've argued that a lot with my Green Party hat on. I've argued for a carbon tax because it gives you the ability to actually set a very clear trajectory for where the carbon price is going. And once you've done that, all the companies that are producing carbon dioxide understand what they need to do to reduce their costs. Now, that was a policy introduced into the European Union in 1992. Again, imagine where we'd be if in 1992 a couple of EU countries hadn't blocked that proposal, and we'd had a serious price on carbon since then. Anyway, that didn't happen, but what happened instead was this EU emissions trading system, and that's about requiring companies that produce carbon dioxide to buy a permit to do that. it's an alternative. It's not such a good alternative in my view, but it does again put a price for carbon into the market. You can see the graph there showing you what happened with the carbon price in Europe after that emissions trading system was introduced. And actually the market collapsed twice, and that's because heavy energy users in the European economy pushed so hard, lobbied so hard for too many permits to be produced that there was no scarcity in the market and the system didn't work. Anyway, the better news is the third time they withdrew a lot of permits and the market is now stabilised, and the cost of producing carbon dioxide in the market is about 100 euros a tonne at the moment. And that is putting a serious pressure on European industry to move away from fossil fuels. Again, with my Green Party finance and economy hat on, we say that the price should be £100 a tonne, moving to £500 a tonne by 2030. So this is my, this is my trajectory, this is my upward price line. But you can see that the actual market system now is moving close to the proposals, which when we made them, everybody was like, you're completely crazy. So again, this is showing you that this putting a price on carbon is really starting to work. I won't talk about the carbon border adjustment unless somebody wants me to when we get to questions. A couple of other things that are happening in the European context. Firstly, sustainability reporting. So when I started on this agenda as the Parliament's rapporteur, one of the things that really amazed me was that people working in the finance sector thought it was absolutely fine that you didn't know what was happening with your money. They would invest your money, maybe they'd be cutting down a rainforest somewhere in Borneo and putting in a palm oil plantation, and all those, actually not bonobos, orangutans in this case, would be made homeless and would become extinct. But not only could you not stop that, you didn't even have a right to know that was happening. And about half the finance company people I spoke to when we were introducing this agenda thought that was absolutely fine. Anyway, those days are over now. We've absolutely shone a spotlight on what's happening with your money and the impacts of your investments. And that's because of this mandatory disclosure regime, which was introduced in March 2021. It's not without its problems, but it's absolutely leading the world in terms of making sure you have a right to know what your money's doing. A slightly more ambitious project, and I think this is a classic bit of EU lawmaking myself. It's unbelievably ambitious and not terribly practical, but this is an attempt to define what is the sustainable economy. Now, if we're going to issue green bonds, if you're going to say, I want my money invested in sustainable sectors, then we need to know what those sustainable sectors are. And this is an attempt to define this. So far, they've got as far as defining climate change mitigation. So economic activities that will reduce the impacts of CO2. So renewable energy would be an example, or climate change adaptation, which might be something like flood defences. We know that climate change is having impacts, so let's adapt to deal with them. And the really depressing news about this, so I haven't got a slide about this, but the really depressing news about this is that, again, the lobbyists were extremely active here, and through political pressure, they forced both gas and nuclear into this sustainable taxonomy. Now, I'm not saying we're going to live without gas tomorrow. I would say we should live without nuclear tomorrow, but again, something we can come back to later. But to say that either gas or nuclear are sustainable, just to me invalidates the whole point of having this taxonomy. And again, that's what happens, unfortunately, when science gets confronted by politics, vested interests, and heavy-duty lobbying. This is the bit of law I like most, because I've had the most to do with changing this one, and it's actually working quite well. So they call it benchmarks. It's more like indexes. So a lot of investment managers, they don't actually choose individual companies to invest your money, and they just choose an index of companies, and then somebody else is choosing which companies are in that index. And this piece of law determines what those indexes will be like for two particular categories of benchmarks that are called climate transition benchmarks and Paris aligned benchmarks. And so effectively, if your money is going to be invested in those indexes, or what they call benchmarks, then they have to meet certain scientific standards. And the reason I like this bit of law is two things. One thing is it's dynamic. They have to do better every year in terms of their CO2 emissions. That's why it's called a transition benchmark. And the other one is that they have to meet scientifically verifiable standards. Now, you could come back and say who's checking, and that is always an important question. I'm sure legal cases will follow. But earlier in the week, I was speaking in Dublin with the person who actually first drafted this law, and he told me that 120 billion euros has shifted as a result of this law out of dirty sectors and into clean sectors. So yeah, obviously we need a lot more than that to shift, but it's a good start anyway. So that's the sort of thing that I was able to achieve with others as an elected politician. But for somebody like me, that doesn't go anywhere near enough, nowhere close to what we need to do fundamentally to change how money and banking works in our society. So what sort of things would I propose? Well, I think a climate roadmap for the financial system, so showing how rapidly we're going to remove those stranded assets from our financial system that's actually quite widely agreed now. That's not even a terribly radical proposal, but we still don't have it. But you know, how do you know your money's safe when you put it in a bank? The answer is the Bank of England is issuing a license. Why aren't they putting strong conditions on those licenses? Why are the banks where we have our money still able to invest in fossil fuel infrastructure or in fossil fuel development? We already know it's not a good investment. We already know that because of the energy transition, those assets will not hold value for very long. So why are banks issued with licenses that we're standing behind, why are they still able to invest in that way? To my mind, it's clear that any bank holding a UK banking license should not be permitted to make those kinds of investments. We could do the same with pensions. I mean, if we had the right politicians, I'm saying, you can imagine the kind of politicians I'm imagining, but you know, these things are perfectly technically feasible from tomorrow, requiring pension and investment funds to remove fossil fuel assets from their investment portfolios, for example, and also credit guidance, which means that the central bank, which again is creating that currency for us all to use, it could be deciding which sectors it could be lent to. Nothing at all for fossil fuels, you know, 40% to this type of sector. We need to get control of the financial system if we're going to manage to direct the economy through the sustainability transition with the speed that's required. Obviously, bans on unsustainable activities. The last point is just like when somebody lends you some money, they have to have assets to back up those loans to some extent. And at the moment, fossil fuel assets are still good for that. If we removed their ability to act effectively as collateral in the financial system, then again, it would remove their credibility. So this is quite technical stuff, but it's also stuff that's kind of really obvious and doable. And I think some of the progress I've talked about is already having an impact, as I've demonstrated. But there's a lot more we could be doing just to change the way the financial system works, just to make it impossible, really, to continue to finance the unsustainable economy. So now I'm turning from being an economist to being a shaman for a little while. Oh, 5 minutes left. Okay, I have to whiz through this bit. Thanks for waving. So I'm going to finish now by coming back to this question of ownership and looking at it in a broader way. And I hope I've indicated some serious concerns about how sustainable finance, if implemented through the market paradigm and with a focus on property rights, could threaten the ownership rights of people in some of the poorer countries of the world. In fact, some of those very countries that are bearing the brunt of the climate crisis, while they don't have responsibility for causing it. It's something of a cliche in green circles to say that the areas of the world where property rights are not so strongly established or defended are the very same areas where the natural world has been better protected. This insight brings important questions about the link between the nature of our relationship with the natural world and our ability to protect it. I remember the world-changing impact on me of meeting Daniel, who was a native of an American tribe in Central America. I met him about 30 years ago, and it was the first time somebody had actually said to me in person, "The earth doesn't belong to us, we belong to the earth." That was central to his worldview, and it really blew apart my worldview. It's really quite hard for me to describe how that's changed my thinking on its head over the intervening years. And it's really influenced my understanding of our relationship with nature. And it's changed my approach to economics as well. Now, this sort of phrase and this understanding can feel very distant from our urban 21st century worldview, but I think it's worth remembering that we are all descended from indigenous people. And we need to find our way back to that sort of connection that indigenous people have with the land, and that essential connection with local place. And we can do that wherever we live. I met another really lovely woman from Central America, and she was an exile because she was threatened with, well, with the death squads in Central America. And she came to live in Spain, and she was really downhearted and despondent, and she said, I can't contact my ancestors, because she needed some drugs, let's face it, that's what they use, psychoactive drugs, and to be out in the right sort of space. And one time she came into the parliament, she was absolutely delighted. She said, I found the mountain and I found the right drugs, and she was able to go, make that essential connection. And that was crucial to her livelihood and her well-being. And I'm not saying the thing about psychoactive drugs, I wouldn't do that myself, but that way of connecting with nature is absolutely fundamental to the well-being of all of us, I believe. So before I went off to the European Parliament, I did some work on what I call the bioregional economy, as John mentioned. And I continue to think that the philosophy of bioregionalism is valuable in helping us reconnect with our local place. So bioregions are defined naturally rather than as a consequence of some sort of long distant war or gifts of land to somebody that came over with William the Conqueror or whatever it was. I'm just going to quickly, I haven't got time to talk about bioregions, but I will quickly show you that in New Zealand they have their bioregions mapped out. They're often defined by river watersheds, and so if you look at the river authorities, that might be something like what it would look like in this country. It's important to notice how different it is from the sorts of local authority areas that we live in, which actually often have rivers as their boundaries. Anyway, I see I'm running out of time, so I won't have much time to cover this, but again, feel free to come back to this in your questions. But just to say, I live in Stroud, and in Stroud we have many varieties of apple. This is Dave Casper from our local orchard, and they run a business selling you these apples. And the sense of connection you have in having an apple that was bred in Stroud. Anyway, he tells these stories. It's great. You should probably have him come here. It's fantastic, the stories he tells. And that sense of connection every time you're eating an apple. You do not feel like waking up in the morning and saying, I'm going to Tesco to buy a pineapple, because that is such a thin relationship compared to what it feels like to buy a locally grown apple. And I also think it's important to recognise the damage that we're doing through our disconnection from nature and this idea of nature deficit disorder. Our urban lives are dominated by systems that we've built ourselves, and I'm sure a lot of people in this room are already reconnecting with nature, but to me that's absolutely fundamental to that sense of well-being and to building a better connection as part of the sustainability journey that we're all on. I like to say falling in love with your native soil, but some people have an issue with the word native, so maybe we'll skip that. But just coming back to I'll finish with this one, just coming back to my question about who owns the earth. At the moment, all decisions are dominated by one species, our species. How can we bring these other species into our decision making? Well, one important proposal is creating legal rights for nature, a legal framework that prioritises the intrinsic rights of nature. It's based on this connection between the human and the natural worlds, and it's really rejecting that human-centric or anthropocentric approach, which just treats nature as property and just sees the whole world in terms of property rights. So I think we need to find a way of asserting the natural rights of nature, whether that's a river, whether that's trees, whether that's local mountains, giving them a stake in the legal world and in the market system. And also, this has happened in New Zealand, where this river already has legal rights, but also making sure we bring young people into our decision-making systems, because the people who are dominating power are human beings of a certain age, indeed my age, and of a certain colour, my colour, in this part of the world. And the future belongs to us all, and we all have a stake, and we all need to have equal power in deciding how we protect the climate and the planet for everybody. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Molly. So we have about 20 minutes or so for questions or comments. Try and not do the usual, making a speech. Try to ask a question, or else I'll have you as the chair. So, yes, Claire McKeown.
First of all, you're an absolute inspiration.
Oh, that's very kind. Thank you.
My question very quickly is on the energy wind farms. How did they come about? We have an opportunity now. There's a lot of wind that we've got going on offshore, big wind opportunity, but it was only by the private sector. How do we actually encourage our government to do legislation, regulation, or minimum amount of community? And I think let's look back at our desire for change. So Greta, just really about that, because the next generation of renewable electricity to transform our economy, decarbonise our heat system and our transport system. So those wind turbines are key. The ownership of them and the income that comes from them should be shared across the country.
Yeah, thank you for your kind words. I'm just going back to this slide because this is Bristol Energy Co-op, and they were sitting around about 10 years ago asking themselves exactly that question. Now, we don't have a supportive environment for community renewables. We're going to get a new government soon. It will be slightly better, but not that much better in terms of community renewables anyway. But in Bristol, they have set up this cooperative. It is a cooperative, Bristol Energy, Bristol Community Energy, and they are incredibly supportive, and I would suggest you just give them a ring. Andy is the main guy there. He wants to encourage other people to do the same thing. I'm sure he'll tell you it's quite a lot of work and it's not that easy, but they have installed capacity that they own. I've got shares in that, and I've also got shares in Gloucestershire Renewable Energy, which is the other one closest to me. So that's the other thing. The FX, if you don't know about FX, they are always offering sustainable investments, so you can really put your money into the sustainable economy of the future through that route. But I would give him a ring. Tell him I said to ring him, because I know him quite well, and yeah, he knows I always go around and say how brilliant they are, so he won't be surprised.
I'll put you in touch with Molly after as well. Anybody else? Yes, Lydia.
So you were showing that graph about ETS price, but of course there was a EU ETS price and the UK ETS price is much lower right now. So what do you think we need to do in terms of raising that UK ETS price?
Well, you're right, and the reason is when we left European Union, a lot of laws, they sort of cut and pasted the laws, and every time they watered them down, and in this case they issued more licenses. So it's a competitive market. The price will be set by the number of licenses in the market. If you increase the number of licenses, which was a decision made to help high energy industry, then the price will fall. So what do you think the answer is? Rejoin the EU. That's my answer. Or try lobbying Rishi Sunak, which is easier.
Jane, do you want to ask?
It's not a question, but I just wanted to follow up with the wind farm.
Yeah.
The Danish case, because that was actually benchmarked by the South Korean government like 3 years ago, and it's probably the largest wind farm in the world. If they manage to complete all the establishment of the wind farm. But then what needed was some strong political willpower of the Korean government, enough for the president to come out and say that support for infrastructure. But the problem was that as the opposition party came to the power in 2022, essentially under the threat of just wanted to follow up with that. Which I call really
I would say about that, it's a really important point that some countries of the world are doing tremendous work on investment in the green transition, and they're not always the countries you expect. So I tried to give some examples of some countries that were already 100% renewables. But as you say, South Korea has made some really important progress. So has Japan, actually so has China. So quite often we hear, oh, we're world leading or whatever, but the world is working together on this. I find a lot of hope in that, actually. It's 30 years too late, but remember the super tanker, try and find some hope in that.
Claire's happy. She's going to go to Stroud and then to Seoul.
Yeah, come to Stroud, come and visit. That'd be great. But think about the money in your pension and what that's doing now. That's the point. And that could be, I don't know where the university's reserves are invested. There's another big
5 million. 5 million this university's invested in fossil fuels.
There we are. There's another point to lobby. Get that put into renewables.
Yeah, I love your talk. It's really interesting. The point of that is in a post-2008 world, you look at how the financial institutions dealt with 2008. How can we expect difference? No matter if if the likes of pension funds and are moving across to other forms of infrastructure, it's still going to be good with private capital. As was said, it's not going to in any way filter out in a more equitable sense. In my mind, and just, I guess, I don't know your thoughts on how that may happen, because it looks to me like it absolutely will not happen.
Look, I would say I went into this agenda with an approach pretty much like yours. I was extremely sceptical about the finance sector and pretty hostile to them, to be honest with you. One thing I'll say is some of the people involved there are definitely good guys, and that's because they've got kids just like we have, and they look at the facts we're looking at and they're scared. The sectors that are really leading on this are insurance and pensions. Insurance because they're already making massive payouts because of climate impact, so they absolutely understand that this is a business requirement for them. Pensions because they have to continue to pay money long into the future, and so they need to avoid these stranded assets. So there's two parts of the finance sector there that are actually already, I think, really constructive part of making this shift. But the other thing is, I mean, from my point of view as a Green, what we try to do is frame the market. So okay, I mean, yeah, am I anti-capitalist? I did write a book called Market, but I don't think you shouldn't ever have markets. I think for shoes and, you know, let's say a range of consumer goods, markets actually work pretty efficiently, but you need to frame them. And what that framing involves limiting the amount of profits that can be withdrawn, limiting the damage they're doing to the climate, making sure they treat employees properly. And that's the point of SFDR that I talked about, because all those companies now that are attracting investment, they have to report a wide range of indicators, including how many women they have on their board, you know, the sustainability impact in a number of different ways of their activities. So we are sort of reeling them in. Where we're not doing so well is in terms of the sharing of the value, and that's the bit that, yeah, obviously to me is still really important. But I would say that the framing of markets is really advancing quickly, and that has been partly a result of 2008, I think, because what was seen was that people then were just effectively using money to make money, and that was bringing no benefit at all to the real economy. And so, I mean, we could talk a lot about finance and how it works and how we could frame it better, but effectively we do have I mean, it's that we again, isn't it? Politicians could change the way banks operate so that they lend to certain sectors and not other sectors, but the levers are there. Will the politicians choose to use them?
Yeah.
Dennis and then.
Thanks for your talk. I just wanted to talk more about the shamanistic bit at the end.
I'm sorry, yeah, I shouldn't have spent so long on sustainable finance.
Yeah, I find myself again this evening, I found this before, constantly wrestling with the individual and the collective and the small scale, the local and the global, the individual and the system. You looked at something very early on when you were talking about relation to our individual psychology, how you feel, how you deal with this, the sense of role element you can have. But you said it's a political struggle, and that's where I think, in a sense, somewhere in there's grounds for living, hopefully, somewhere in that political struggle. So I suppose I'd like to talk a little bit more about the bit in the middle between me as an individual paddling out of the career. I can take your good tanker thing. I've got this picture of me. I'm paddling my career. Everybody's paddling their own individual.
Yeah.
You've got these huge big super tankers all moving along in a certain direction, making destruction as they go. So how do they connect the paddling in my small canoe with the sort of getting the super tanker to turn around and have a transformation in the system? We've talked about the financial thing, but I seem to in that sense, but I'm still wondering what's how do you connect?
Well, one thing I would say at the beginning is that the political system is not favourable in the United Kingdom. It's a very bad political system. You know, it's basically swinging back between one party and another. And so the current government is like creating a massive tide, pushing your canoe this way while you're trying to paddle that way, right? So that would really help. And I think Ed Miliband is a great guy. I mean, I'm a Green Party person, but Ed Miliband was a great energy secretary, and he will again be a great energy secretary. Another what if you know, if people had voted for chaos with Ed Miliband in 2015, we would be in a totally different place now. So politics really matters. Politics in that sense really matters. But I think politics really matters to me as well, and maybe this is true of John as well, because it's a community of action for me. So I'm in a party with a number of people who have the same understanding of what we need to do. I don't know where I would have been psychologically if I hadn't had that for the past 35 years. It's not about being an elected politician. It's about when you have these fears or these understandings or these wild enthusiasms or whatever it is, there's a community there that embrace that and share it with you, and you're acting together. And so I think you don't have to necessarily do that in a political party, though. You could do that through community level action. So one of the things I've done recently is joined the core group of my community farm again, partly because I see all the apples and, you know, all that stuff, which is, yeah, which makes you feel good, let's face it. And if it makes you feel good and it's not taking up a lot of energy and it's feeding people, you know, my food comes from a mile down the road, that's got to be a good thing. So, yeah, I think if you get that sense, here's community action that is good, then do that as well. But I absolutely agree with you. I mean, it was brilliant having my home insulated, but that was just me on my own, and that's nothing like as empowering or as reassuring as taking action together with the community. So you can work with Claire and set up this community renewable company, right? It's going to be brilliant.
Yes, never underestimate the power of being with people who give a shit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very good for your mental health, actually.
Definitely.
Peter, you're
Well, it was kind of similar to this question that I have a daughter who was like 8 or 9 at the turn of the century, and she thought she was going to be banged out of the netting bug. And the computers were crashing at that time.
Y2K.
Y2K, yeah. So, and she's kind of concerned about the climate and anxiety. That kind of bothers her. I'd like to explore how some of the issues that you talked about, the way pass on that message to people who are concerned.
Yeah.
Anxious, not concerned. Anxious.
Absolutely. I'm not, I mean, it's just absolutely not my expertise. I feel I need to say something about that because it is so important, because what I'm saying is frightening. It frightens me, you know, and I'm passing it on to young people who've got a lot more of this to look forward to, actually. And I think about my grandchildren and I feel afraid for them as well. So I kind of just register that. It's not really something that I can give any expertise on, because I'm not a psychologist and I'm not a psychology expert. But I think, as I said on the slide, being part of a community that's taking action really helps. Not sort of sitting there just with your knowledge of what's wrong, but having a sense of what you can do to change it. And those things can be individual, but they're much more powerful when you're doing those as part of a community. And I do think that, you know, I mean, for me, obviously the climate crisis has been there for a long time for me, but now we've got war in Ukraine and war in Gaza, and it's very emotionally demanding, I think, to live through all of those crises at the same time. So I absolutely think escapism, when you need it, is an important part of this. But, you know, nature can be a form of escapism as well. It doesn't have to be Middlemarch, which is back on iPlayer, everybody. But, you know, those... Because I mean, I'm a sort of quite a driven person. I would always like, don't waste your time with dramas. You know, you should be reading more about the climate crisis. But when I became an MEP, I absolutely needed, and that's the other thing, arts. You know, the arts. I mean, I'd always been a bit sniffy about actors as well. You know, but they saved my life. Actors saved my life when I was a stressed MEP. So I think we shouldn't underestimate the importance of arts. Music, as we discussed with Callum. You know, this builds community as well. So I think. Yeah, there's so much that we are as human beings. We're only using a tiny part of that, and any connection you can make to deeper parts of yourself, I think would really help your daughter. And then also, who wants to go and buy plastic crap if you've been down the pub and, you know, listen to Callum playing his music wherever he plays? You know, it's much more fulfilling to us as human beings than whatever we might buy on Black Friday.
Thanks. Molly, thank you so much for a fantastic lecture. Loved everything you said, and particularly the way that you connected the micro level of how we see and relate to our natural world, how we connect each other, our actions through community, up to macro level as well. Fantastic. I wonder, from your own experience, could you talk a bit more about your work on policy and planning and the precedents we might have to enable those sort of things we're talking about here today? So we can see there are energy cooperatives, community energy cooperatives in Northern Ireland. But we're so far behind the Republic of Ireland and the rest of the UK in terms of infrastructure and planning. For example, I was in England a couple of weeks ago, took the ferry over, was driving an EV, was blown away by the amount of charging facilities, high speed across England, the wind turbines in flat areas. So we have this issue here in the north where we have the concentration of turbines in the west, which is predominantly poor, the concentration and consumption of energy predominantly east, which is wealthier. So how do we reconcile policy and planning so that we're not exacerbating energy injustices and community opposition to energy as well, alongside encouraging the type of cooperative methods that you're pointing to? So I just want to you talk a bit about that and maybe some of your examples you might have from other areas where you're seeing innovations and policy and planning to enable these things.
This is quite interesting because it's a real example of the grass is greener, isn't it? Because I think our energy infrastructure is absolutely abysmal. You know, the grid is very poorly invested in. We're way behind our EV charging targets. So
it's so much better.
Well, yeah, maybe we all need to be ambitious. But honestly, I don't feel, I think you know more about this than I do, to be honest with you. I don't feel I've got expertise on what's happening in Northern Ireland, but I would say if UK politics is broken, you know, Northern Ireland politics is seriously broken. If you don't have a government who can support you in all those things you want to change, and it is possible to organise things at community level, but I've done that for a long time, and I absolutely realise the importance of having supportive politicians, you know, whether it's planning or whether it's investment or whether it's just giving leadership. I mean, for example, it was interesting being in the Republic and just hearing every so often on the radio, you know, there's an ad, one of those government-sponsored ads. We never get them, do we? We never get them. And there was quite a few, all sorts of different things. I can remember when we used to get that. This is a government-sponsored information. And you'd be like, oh, shut up. I mean, basically, that was your reaction. But nonetheless, you know, why aren't we getting those now, helping us to understand what we need to be doing right now? There's no guidance at all. When I went through my having my home renovated, it felt like it was really pioneering to get a heat pump put in. I didn't know anybody that had a heat pump. You know, in my community, I live in Stroud. I had to say, well, I'm going to just go for it and do it. And I think that's extraordinary. No support, no information. I'm not really answering your question because I don't know the answer to your question, but I do feel that a lot of the questions that are going to come up about how do we do this better, the answer is going to be better political system. I think that's got to be true here, right?
Oh, definitely.
It's more of a comment than a question. Presentation was fantastic, by the way, but insulating houses and what Scotland has done. I grew up in Aberdeen. I think that's where they tried it for the very first time. And it was people underestimated what impact it had, not in terms of insulating houses, in terms of facilitating conversations with lots of people who were really interested in what renewables could do. They got the house insulated and they really liked that. But it's like, what else can we do? What else can we add?
Right.
And Aberdeen is really important because we were the oil and gas capital of Europe, and it dominated everything for good and bad reasons. My parents, they had their house done as well. I'm the program director for net zero engineering here at Queen's, and I've tried to have a conversation with them on numerous occasions, but they get their house insulated, and all of a sudden they want to have a conversation. I don't know if that says more about me as a lecturer. The impact you can have with actually doing something tangible, but then it happens. And they weren't the only ones. All over the streets, people start having a conversation as well. So it's really impressive the impact it can have, not just in terms of reducing energy demand and things like that, but what it means.
I think that's such an important point, and it's about how change then changes the conversation. So this is very true of my own heat pump as well, because everybody's like, oh, how does that work? In my neighbours, that's very noisy. Somebody further down the road, how does that work? Can I come and see? Everybody was visiting my house. You know, there were at least 6 people then immediately got heat pumps because they saw it was possible. So yeah, I mean, I'm a strong believer in you have an intuitive sense that you need to do something, you should just do that. You don't know what the consequences will be, but if it feels strong, you know, you should do that, and then the consequences follow, and that's just follow that energy. I think it's an important principle. That sounds brilliant anyway.
Yeah, really good.
Also go to the hairdresser, start those conversations with the hairdresser. That's another tip. You can imagine my hairdresser's like, oh no, it's Molly again. Go and make my hair grow long.
You don't have much cost to have a massive program. For example, you just have 40,000. You multiply that by 35 million. That's
Do you know what we have? There is something, a press release that went out about 3 or 4 months ago, which you can find on the Green Party website, which has all these figures. I think it went out at Autumn Conference actually, so that's more like the beginning of October. But what we said, we haven't quite got to the end of our costed manifesto yet, but what we said last time was 100 billion a year for the free home retrofit. But we're not proposing we pay for everybody. We propose that for people who have the ability to raise a mortgage, they get a cheap mortgage for that. That's what happens in Germany. They get a cheap mortgage for the retrofit, and then they also get a lower mortgage going forward, a lower rate if they have retrofitted their home. So it's not all a public expense, but my point there is we need to start by insulating the homes of the people on lowest incomes who probably also have the worst quality homes and are least able to pay for the heat that they need. So we start there. Now, you will have noticed that Labour is proposing something like this, and they say, they started off saying 28 billion, and they're now sort of backtracking on that. But we reckon 100 billion a year over 10 years would be most of what we needed for people who can't afford to insulate their own homes. That was what we said in 2019, and that would have insulated a lot of the housing stock by 2030.
So just a statement aside from senior executive, vice executive said recently they can function better without a living government. Function better without an assembly.
But they can't change anything, right? They can't change policy.
They can't make their own budget. They can't budget. They can't reallocate resources. They can function better. Just think about this. These houses that
and I mean, you know, I've seen the problems. Well, I mean, what am I saying? It's democracy, isn't it? People don't agree with each other. It does slow things down. I mean, if everybody agreed, we wouldn't need democracy. But, you know, if we had a dictatorship, maybe things would be more efficient, but we'd be living in a dictatorship. So politics is a messy business. There's no point in hiding that. It does slow things down. You have to agree. But I think if you start out from the principle, we're really in the shit here and we all need to get this sorted, and then you understand that you're bringing in all the voices and trying to reach consensus. To be honest, on climate policy, until quite recently, the UK was pretty much in a place of consensus. It's the worst thing that's happened is that the Tories are now using this as a sort of divisive political issue. That's incredibly damaging. I don't think it'll last long, and it doesn't seem to be winning them many votes. So I think we're in a sort of bad interim period. But yeah, things are easier if you don't have people disagreeing with each other, but that's life, isn't it? And it's democracy.
Listen, I'm going to start wrapping things up and try and summarise my own thoughts on what Molly has said. And one of the most important things is, what is our theory of change? How do we think change happens? There's legislation we can see that can work. There's issues of where to find the money. And I remind people that there's always money for war. You ever notice that? We could send billions off to help Ukraine and so bail out the banks. Remember that? 2008. So never, ever, ever, children, be bamboozled by those that there's not enough money in the bank. Technically speaking, you know, whatever is technically possible is financially feasible. One of the better dead white guys, Keynes, said that. The real issue is, do we have the assets, the resources, the capacity to be able to do the things we need? No, we need to raise money or we need to borrow. That's bullshit. A government cannot run out of the money it itself creates. The only things we can be concerned about, as Molly pointed out, is land, assets, resources, people, and so on. So but that raises the issue, what is our theory of change at this moment of existential and indeed equity crisis? The other issue then is, let's give 2 cheers for the apocalypse. People have the apocalypse gets a bad rap. The apocalypse actually means the lifting of a veil. It's a revelation. And there is a lot of apocalyptic thinking, which usually is quite nihilistic, negative. We spoke a lot about, and I'm glad we've spoken openly about the psychological impacts of this issue. I don't talk about it enough in a way. But this moment of crisis is an opportunity in terms of revealing something different. That sounds quite religious, and I'm not religious myself, but I do respect those with a faith background. But there is, you know, in this moment to see, it's a wonderful phrase from a great climate scientist who actually was a Christian as well, a guy called Mike Hume, one of the preeminent climate scientists in the world. And he said, it's not what we can do for the climate, that kind of male, enlightenment, industrial, we got to fix this. The tech bros, Elon Musk, God forbid, is going to save us. You know, that somehow technology is going to come in and save us, that we're going to fix the climate. He said, it's not what we can do for the climate, it's what the climate can do for us. What is it affording us now to rethink the good life, our connections with each other, and so on? So that's why I do think the apocalypse, we should be less concerned about this vision of it being horrible. Same reason why people get a bad understanding of anarchism. It's not anarchy, it's simply status social order, where most human beings have lived for most of evolutionary history. Just that's a cheer up for anarchism. And then the last thing I think is this most important issue. And what Molly, I think, was saying is, you know, not everything that we face can be overcome, but you can't overcome unless it's faced. Let's tell the truth about how bad the situation is, but not wallow in that often despair. Where do we find the most important thing we need now is hope. Hope. Where do we get that? It's through agency of the type that Molly was talking about, collective agency, but also taking care of yourself. You are not a traitor to the cause if you go get pissed every so often, if you watch Middlemarch or Jane Austen, or in my case, science fiction and American Hollywood movies. Self-care is an important part of this project as well. And so how do we integrate that, yes, big struggle that many of us are involved in, and many of us are in different places in that journey, but it is inevitable now. It's up there now with death and taxes, that we will be moving in this direction, but at what cost and at what speed? And can we avoid all the pain and suffering that may come if we don't act quickly enough? So thank you, Molly, for giving us hope. A bit of hopium is always good in terms of going back to your psychoactive drugs. And we'll have to have you back again so you can do your full-on shaming for us. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
In my bag, I got a wee present to give to Molly as a thank you gift from our small centre. It's not drugs, by the way.
I don't take drugs. I don't know why I said that. It's not good.
There you go, Molly. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Callum, for